Welcome back, everybody, to the Skift Travel Podcast. I'm Skift's editor-in-chief, Sarah Kopit, as always, joined by Skift's head of research, Seth Borko. Hey, Seth.
Hey, Sarah. How you doing, everybody?
Good. So today we are recording just a few days into the Paris Olympic Games. And we've enjoyed, I don't know, what is your favorite thing been to watch so far? I like swimming. It's the only time I ever watched swimming, but I've taken in some swimming. How about you?
The swimming has been great. I like the guy who had to do the pommel horse. He had just one job, just the pommel horse. I was a big fan of that. That was a fun event.
So even though we're only a few days into the games here, this is our last recording on this topic. So far, we've talked to Ben Smith, the CEO of Olympic partner Air France KLM. We talked to Patrick Mendes, Accor's CEO of Europe and Africa. They're also a partner of the Olympics. And Ben and Patrick had some really great insights, not only about the Olympics, but about sports tourism in general. So if you haven't listened, I highly recommend you do. But that is only after you also listen to today's conversation and today's guest. We have saved the best for last. We're speaking with our friend and colleague, Greg Klassen, today. Greg is currently the Senior Director of Skift Advisory, but he was previously the CEO of Destination Canada, where he worked to take advantage of the 2010 Olympic Games in Vancouver, Canada. Hey, Greg, how you doing?
Hey, guys. Good. How are you all?
Good. So, like I said, so far in this series, we've covered the Olympic impact on travel, aviation, hospitality, but we would be remiss not to talk about it from a destination perspective. So Paris has been, I would say, maybe not as much in the spotlight as they maybe want to be right now. I think that, we're only a few days out from the opening ceremonies, but there's been a lot of bad press going on about that. So I'm curious, first tell us a little bit about what you did in conjunction with the Vancouver Games in 2010, but also like what you make of all of the apologies and controversy that have had to come out of the Games in Paris.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, isn't it? I'm going to start with your second question first, Sarah. And that is, it's a curiosity because Paris is such an iconic city, isn't it? Everybody closes their eyes and knows what they think and see when they hear of Paris. It's the most visited city in the world. It's got somewhere between 45 and 50 million. That's a ridiculous amount of visitors every single year. So while other destinations that host Olympics tend to look for that big brand boost, because of the Olympics. Think some of those smaller Albertville that used to host a Winter Olympics or other places that we don't know very much about. But Paris is the iconic city. So it's hard to see what the tourism bump is going to be. It's hard to understand what that brand lift is going to be. And I think what you just said is that they've been kind of riddled with problems in their first few days. Is it actually going to give us a negative view of Paris? Is the water of the Seine suddenly going to be negative for us? So good questions that you have, and whether there's going to be that iconic brand lift that we get from these games, or whether it'll just be a meh. I don't know. It might change.
I mean, what do they say about publicity? Like, there's no thing as bad publicity, or such things. I don't know. Like, part of me thinks the Last Supper with the drag queens, like, part of me thinks they cannot have not known that would draw a whole bunch of controversy, a whole bunch of headlines. You think that's what they wanted, or do you think they really didn't? I don't know. What do you think? Could they possibly have not known?
Okay, so there's two Americans and a Canadian talking about European culture here. So let's start with that.
Fair.
The drag queens might be by design. It might be controversial. We are talking about it. It may be somewhat negative in its publicity, but it's also pretty outrageous at the same time. And maybe it is consistent with that sort of iconic approach. This is the place that had the Moulin Rouge. This is the place that was a little bit different even 100 years ago, before we even contemplated those things. So I give them a bit of a pass on the drag queen Last Supper.
Oh, the French.
I mean, you've been kind of behind the scenes on one of these things. When an event like this gets planned, I mean, how many, just to stay on this topic as an example, how many people have to sign off on something like that? Like, is it really like, is there a coordinated push to say, this is the brand we're going to have for Paris for this Olympic Games? Or is it sort of like you have your own little world of the opening ceremony and I've got my own little world of this? How does that actually work for a city like Paris?
Yeah, you know what? Probably fewer than you think get sign off on this idea. And Sarah might know this because I know you've been in the sort of creative industries before, but you get these people taking on these big projects and they ask for creative control. They don't want 6 government officials, French government officials in particular, overseeing the creative control that they have. So this is a risk, and they're taking it. They've taken it.
I would tend to agree with Greg there. I mean, I don't know what their contracts say, but yeah, I bet that the person that planned that particular portion of the Olympic opening ceremony probably did have some pretty ironclad creative control for that. Just a guess, wild guess.
Your first question was really around how do you leverage these games for tourism destinations? And again, when I was in charge of Destination Canada during a period of time that Vancouver was the host of the Olympics. Vancouver, of course, is an iconic Canadian city, one of our most telegenically beautiful cities. It's surrounded by mountains and ocean. And we had a single we thought, a generation opportunity to showcase Vancouver and to showcase Canada. We wanted to change the brand of Canada at the time. We had that hewers of lumber and drawers of water, hewers of lumber, Moose Mountains and Mounties kind of destination. We wanted a more progressive view of what we really were in Canada. And we pinpointed the Olympics. We said, 3 billion of the world's eyeballs are going to be on Vancouver during a 2-week period of time. Hey, let's take advantage of those eyeballs. So our priority for the Olympics wasn't necessarily the visitors that were coming to the Olympics. It was more about those television cameras and those screens and those social media outlets that were going to be telling our story for us. So we concentrated our strategy on making sure that we were going to show off Vancouver and show off Canada in the best possible light to those 3 billion eyeballs that were going to be watching the games from parts of the world. So a little bit of a misnomer about major events, major sporting events like F1, like FIFA, and like the Olympics. It's really not the people that are coming to the destination. Our hotels will more or less be full and attracting a pretty strong rate, and our planes will probably be more or less full. But it really is the long tail effect of all those people seeing this beautiful destination, whether that's Vancouver, Paris, or soon to be Los Angeles. What does it look like? Does that give you that sense of, I want to go there?
Let me ask a question about Vancouver, which is, did it work? Did you see the long tail effects?
We did, because we had a strategy. We were lucky enough to get $25 million from the government to be spent over 5 years to invest in what we called the Olympic strategy, which was pre-strategy. 5 years prior to the Olympics, we were starting to already build the strategy. We had during the Olympics, where we hosted media and helped give them B-roll and images and stories and storylines and media support coverage, because there's a lot of downtime in Olympics. Weather delays and those kinds of things. So we wanted our stories to be pushed in there. So we gave them content that they could choose to play or not play, and they played our content. So we had during the Olympics, and then the post-Olympics we called Harvesting the Afterglow. And that was basically about saying, now that you've got all these warm and fuzzy thoughts about Vancouver and Canada, hey, here's a trip. Why don't you plan your trip here? And it did work. We did go back. We did a number of pieces of research to help see, did we get the brand lift? Yes. Did we get the visitation lift? Yes, we got the visitation lift. And really the long tail, and it's been about, 14 years since we hosted that Olympics. Vancouver needs about 20 more hotels in order to meet up demand. We're almost always full, and our rate is ridiculous and off the charts. So I think the long tail effect would suggest that Vancouver is now one of those destinations on fire, and perhaps pushing the edges of over tourism during certain periods of time of the year.
So do you think that that is maybe like the Bible of what you would tell a maybe a less touristy or a less like not Paris, not Los Angeles, somewhere that is really looking to grow its tourism? Is that the playbook that you would tell them to use if they were getting a big sporting event in their area?
It is 100%, I believe, the right playbook. And yet, almost every destination since Vancouver Olympics has not used the playbook at all, Paris included. There is no strategy. Olympics are usually sold to the IOC or to their residents on the strength of it's going to build tourism, but there's never a tourism plan. There is never that plan to help leverage tourism, to leverage the 3 to 6 billion eyeballs on screens to watch those destinations, to help turn that into warm and fuzzy thoughts about that destination and future visitation. So it's not really being used. And to apply to FIFA, to apply to Formula One, some of those other iconic sporting events that will also attract major eyeballs, could use the same strategy.
Well, I think it's interesting you talk about the audiences and who has a stake at the table. And, these games, and not just the Olympics, but FIFA, F1, all these games, they're getting more and more and more expensive to host. I remember the Rio Olympics, right? The Brazil Olympics, they built all these stadiums all over the country, and many of them are crumbling now. So you have these kind of infrastructure boondoggles. And I think I've even read that like the IOC is kind of struggling to get some bids for some of these large events because they are so expensive. So I think with a good strategy, you can see a tourism return. Do you think that tourism return can truly pay for 20 new stadiums? I mean, that's a huge cost to host a game like this.
Yeah. I think the stadium builds are based on a different kind of strategy. It's based on creating centers of excellence for football or repurposing those stadiums for other reasons. And again, I think this is where Vancouver has done a good job. Because we were able to sort of retain some of those major facilities that were purpose-built for the Olympics. But those that no longer retained that, we've turned our speed skating center, for instance, into a community center. And it's extremely well used as a result of all of that. So it really is making sure that you have a plan for these assets that you're creating, not just purpose-built for Olympics, but with a plan afterwards. So it's not necessarily that tourism is going to be the long tail of those, but opportunities for training centers, for skiing excellence. I mean, Whistler hosted our downhill, who did very well with that and retained some of those training facilities. A lot of them turn into tourism attractions. At the same time, we have a sliding center up at Whistler now that you can try yourself if you so choose to become an amateur luger. I haven't been brave enough to do that yet, but one day it's on my list.
My husband desperately wants to go up to Lake Placid in New York, right, and try out their luge. I think they still have one there that the public can.
And when did they last host the Olympics? I mean, the long tail for Lake Placid has been ridiculous, right? It is just this
it's like 50 years or something like that. Yeah,
50 years. So what a great example for tourism is that they really truly developed that place for the next 50 years and have leveraged it very, very well.
So one of the things that it kind of makes my skin crawl when I think about it, but they're going to have the Olympians jump into the Seine and they're going to swim there. And I live here in Brooklyn, and almost every day I walk over the Gowanus Canal. Now, I'm not saying the Gowanus Canal and the Seine are the same, but I don't know. These games, you often have these kind of environmental components to it. Like you were talking about the natural beauty of Vancouver. Not everywhere is like that. When you're in a city like Paris, you hear all of the, the bacteria contamination in the river and what have you. But this is a very roundabout way to a question about the environmental impact of these games and how you kind of balance, maybe what you have, what might be being the impact, what might be being destroyed in the process. Does the environmental footprint of large sporting events, does that really weigh on destinations? And do you really take a minute to kind of think about how this is going to impact the natural environment for which, your city might really be known for?
Yes, I would believe, it does. In fact, it's one of the criteria, I think, of the IOC. It's probably one of the criteria of FIFA. Those major events now have their sort of corporate social responsibility elements and the check boxes that they need to do in order to support that. The question, I guess, is it real? Is that just a
Yeah.
checkbox exercise? No offense to Paris, who spent, did I hear this right? $2 billion to clean the Seine, and it's still not clean.
Yeah.
That's
But it's also not been clean for like how many hundred, like, I mean, Dickens was writing about this. So yeah.
but if that were really truly one of the outcomes of hosting the Olympics, it would be a really good
Yeah.
thing, wouldn't it? If they,
Yes.
and maybe
Yes,
they
it
got
would.
it 90% and they're just worried about the last 10%. Um, so but I can tell you what Vancouver would have done. We have similar challenges. Every city has challenges.
Yeah.
We have challenges with homelessness and drug addiction in an area of Vancouver called the downtown east side. And instead of trying to cover it up and pretending it didn't exist, the first thing we did was bring media to see the downtown east side. We showed them the drama and the trauma of the challenges that we face as a city, but we also showed them areas of hope. We had centers where we were housing the homeless. We had areas of support. We had community groups. We had soup kitchens and things like that. We wanted to show the media a balanced story, but they were going to find that area. It's only a few blocks away from where they were covering the Olympics. They were going to find it anyway and tell their own stories, but we helped craft that story a little bit better. So it's possible that perhaps Paris could have said, we're hoping for that send, but we didn't quite get it quite right. But here's the work that we're doing to try to clean up the waters. And here's maybe what we've learned as a result that maybe other cities can apply. Wouldn't that have been a slightly better story than nobody wants to go in that water because it's so polluted?
Yeah, and maybe
Yeah.
we can learn some lessons in Brooklyn and clean up the Gowanus a little bit had they followed that idea, right?
They're trying. They're trying every day. They have all their dredges out. And,
Yeah, it was
yeah.
super fun site. I know a guy who once went scuba diving in the Gowanus Canal, and he wore his basically didn't get wet. He was fully covered.
Fully covered. Fully covered. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to take a break. We will be back with Greg just after this.
Welcome back to the Skift Travel Podcast. We are joined today by Greg Klassen, Senior Director of Skift Advisory, and we are talking all things Olympics and destinations. So, Greg, just when we left you before the break, we were talking about some of the ESG stuff, the environmental responsibility, the social responsibility. I wanted to kind of broaden this scope a little bit to some other big sport events. Like I know the World Cup in Qatar has gotten a lot of flack over its human rights record back to building those stadiums and things like that. I mean, how do you, as someone who works with and advises destinations on planning for these events and this sort of things, I mean, we were just talking about whether those ESG things are check boxes or really mandatory and how they're being enforced and how they're being held accountable. I mean, what do you think about a situation like that?
Yeah. Qatar's a really interesting example, isn't it? On the one hand, I think that we all know a lot more about Qatar. I would say that in general, net positive review of how they pulled off the FIFA World Cup. Of course, the most watched, I think, event in history, and I think they did a reasonably good job with all of that. Of course. There were still some major challenges. I know that they were very, very focused on their track record, building those stadiums on the backs of, somewhat close to being indentured labor coming from India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and areas like that, is a significant challenge for them. And I think they tried to get ahead of that story. It's really hard to get ahead of human rights stories in general. And I think they sort of pulled off bits and pieces of it, but I don't think they got quite there yet. So a lot of people's minds may not have been changed as a result of their hosting.
Well, and we're talking so much about the negatives, so cost, environmental and stuff, but there are some great, warm and fuzzy stories that come out of the Olympics. It's like I don't know, one of my favorite parts of the Olympics. I was saying, the pommel horse guy who just does this one thing, and these incredible stories of. I think I saw this. Retired school teacher, ping pong athlete competing for Chile. There's these really amazing cultural stories that come out of the Olympics and personal stories. I mean, talk a bit maybe about how like the good sides of this sort of sports tourism and the connections across cultures and people that when they're done right. I mean, how does that tie into the tourism story?
Yeah, and I think that we'll see that with Paris, right? Right now it's the beginning of the games. We're focusing on some of those negatives and some of the gaffes that have happened. But we're interested in the human stories. We're interested in the performance. We're interested in the agony of becoming a contender, whether you come in with a gold medal or whether you come in last place. There's a story behind every one of those athletes, and I think those will start to dominate the news cycle a little bit more. And they'll, of course, start to tell the great stories about what's going on in Paris, and give us a kind of different narrative. So perhaps we shouldn't judge too harshly Paris at the beginning of the Olympics. Perhaps maybe in 10 days from now, we'll have a better idea of where and how they've pulled off those games itself. But the human stories are what we really long for.
Hey, let me ask you this question. We keep talking about Paris Olympics as driving tourism to Paris, but some of these stories that we're talking about are underdog countries that we maybe didn't know or see. Have you ever heard any stories of like a Paris Olympics driving tourism to a different country because of a really good competitive team?
Well, as a 13-year-old boy, I was kind of in love with Nadia Comaneci and wanted to go to Romania. So I don't know whether that is relevant to this conversation, but I really did think Romania was going to be a really cool place to go. Seth, you're way too young to know who Nadia Comaneci is.
I'm not, though. I remember. I watched. I was at the right age where I think we're about. Well, she might be a little bit older than me, but I remember that Mary Lou Retton. Oh, it was so good.
Yeah.
I wonder what happened after the Cool Runnings and the Jamaican bobsled team.
Yeah, like that.
I wonder. Yeah, I mean, that was just such a great movie and such a great story.
It was, and I think again, Jamaica would have been very interesting. I did a tourism project, in fact, in Jamaica, and they had at the airport they had a big poster of the Cool Runnings dudes from that event. It's still part of their local culture as well, and when you sort of see it, you're reminded of Jamaica, and you may be having again those thoughts of. Even though it's got very little to do with Winter Olympics in Jamaica, normally it was that sort of off the beaten track kind of team that you really wanted to hope for to go to see them in Jamaica. We had a guy from the UK who was a pretty terrible, but he qualified to be a ski jumper. I mean, who goes straight from zero into ski jumping? But this fellow didn't. I think it was called Eddie the Eagle, and he was.
Oh again, yeah, we watched that movie too.
Yes,
yeah, they made that movie too.
And so Google Eddie the Eagle because again, he became this sort of geeky personality that had a goal and he went for it. So yeah, we got these great human condition stories.
Yeah, we're suckers for a good inspirational sports movie here at the Kopit House. So yeah, we've seen them all.
Exactly.
So I mean, let's talk bigger, broader sports tourism. So not just the Olympics. It's a huge trend. Sarah just published an amazing story on the broader market for sports tourism. And by the way, if you're a listener and you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, definitely go ahead and Google Sarah Skift sports tourism. It's a great article. But what do you see as Greg, as like just broadly, you work with destinations across the globe. What is the trend in sports tourism, like looking beyond the Olympics? Like how big of a deal is sports as a driver of destinations and tourism?
To answer that question, it really depends on the sport. There's some sports that lend themselves beautifully to television coverage. Those are the A+ listers. Those are the Olympics. Those are the FIFAs. Those are the F1s. Those are the major events that the whole world tunes into to watch. Those are important. Some of those smaller sports are important to some countries, but not other countries. And if you're targeting some of those countries, handball, for instance, is big in some parts of Europe. So you're going to create a sort of longing and a sense of handball to come to this destination that may be hosting the World Handball. You're not going to get an American to watch handball or a Canadian. We don't even know what that is. But it's really important in some other countries. So some of the smaller sports still garner some good television coverage itself. And some sports, you just aren't watching them on TV, but you're going to go to the destination itself and you're going to try to leverage it. So it really depends on the sort of broad appeal, or even some cases the narrow appeal of those particular sports and events that are either going to draw visitors to the destination itself, or most importantly, help you elevate your brand because it's going to be broadcast through multiple channels.
So let me ask you this, Greg. You work with a lot of leaders of brands, CEOs of destinations, CMOs, government officials. If you were starting with a blank slate, and I can think of a couple of countries where they maybe have a blank slate, like what would your advice to the leader of a government official destination be? Would it be you want to start big, go for the Olympics, bid on the Olympics? Would it be pick a niche? You can dominate handball. Like what advice do you give destination leadership?
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, one of those great questions, because the old days bidding on Olympics was very, very hard. There were 5 or 6 or 7 shortlisted destinations. You had to do your pitch, and you were very, very lucky to win. It's not like that anymore. The hardest part to get to become a host of an Olympic game is getting past to your residents, who generally vote on plebiscites to say whether they actually want the games in their city or province or state or country or not. And in many cases, a lot have been rejected. There are 4 cantons in Switzerland who were vying to become hosts of the Winter Olympics, and all 4 of them rejected it and say, we don't need to spend the money on the Olympics. So Olympics aren't nearly as in demand as they used to be. We know that the United States, Mexico, and Canada are actually getting the FIFA World Cup in the next couple of years. You don't want to know how much money they spent to draw FIFA to these destinations. In Canada, we're spending something like $75 million Canadian per game, just to FIFA itself. This isn't leaving very much extra money to help leverage those eyeballs who are going to be watching that game. There's a hope and a prayer that they're going to turn into brand awareness and visitation, but there isn't a plan because there's no money left for the plan, or there isn't a plan yet. So recognize that these big, huge sports are extremely expensive. They have high security needs that are even more expensive and far less of interest than they used to be. And that's why we're seeing some of those countries like Kazakhstan that are going for the games. Like you see when those Winter Olympics were being held in Sochi in Russia. Again, yep. They're hosting the games, but some of the bigger sort of countries are no longer interested in doing that.
Well, speaking of security concerns, I mean, yet another thing that we didn't even talk about, because so many things happened in the events, were the train disruptions that happened before the opening ceremony. So a lot of people had a hard time even getting to Paris. Some Olympians didn't even make the opening ceremonies because they couldn't get there. For security and technology, what is the burden of the cities who are not just hosting the Olympics, but any of these like major sporting events, technological or otherwise, for security? I assume it has to be just astronomical these days.
It is. I mean, the city of light is also the city of disruptions. There's constant protests in cities like Paris, and of course, this is prime opportunity. The world's they get it. The world's 3 billion eyeballs on Paris. Hey, this would be a good time to strike. This would be a good time to protest. This is a good time to get our message across, and have some levels of disruption into Paris, because they're going to resolve very, very quickly, aren't they? And so they get it that this is an important international event. But I can tell you that puts the fear of God into almost any other destination that might consider the same thing, because they have to manage for those contingencies, and those are very, very hard to do.
So if you're somebody like Kazakhstan, like you just mentioned, I mean, how do you budget for that? They probably don't have the budget for that.
They might also have other ways of managing those challenges in Kazakhstan and places like that. There's less liberal ideas here that support that. So, but they do find the money for it, because again, these are destinations and countries that really want to leverage games to improve and increase their brand on the world stage. They want to be demonstrated as really important, and they also want to show off that Kazakhstan does have Winter Olympic facilities. So So, please consider coming there. And I think a destination like Kazakhstan would do extremely well in tourism because it's almost completely unknown. And there's an opportunity for us to really get to know them and recognize them for some of the amenities that they do have.
Should they build an F1 track as well?
Did you go there?
I did.
Last winter?
I haven't been to Qatar. It's on my list. I'd love to go.
Right. You're going to be the biggest admirer of the Kazakhstan Olympics.
It genuinely looks like a beautiful country to visit. I mean, I'm being very sincere here where I say
right.
It's very much on my list to go to Central Asia and to see it.
Yeah, and post hosting of the Olympics, gosh, I hope I got that right that they are hosting the Olympics. I think they are. And if they're not, then maybe they could be. But I do believe that they are going to benefit hugely from that brand awareness if they have a plan.
Yeah. So let's talk. Last question. Let's talk about maybe some of the kind of emotional benefits of sports tourism. This was one of the things that I really wanted to touch on in the article that I wrote, because I think that we saw, the impact of concerts like Taylor Swift and the Eras Tour, and then you've got the Olympics, F1, the Super Bowl. That was a crossover with Taylor Swift, so that was just like an explosion of media. I don't know how else to say it. These things are some of the last great communal experiences. We're all talking in front of screens right now. We live with our phones pasted in front of our faces. But these live events, they do something a little bit different for us as human beings. We all get together, we cheer, we do it just for the fun of it. How do you think that destinations really benefit from that, emotional kind of spillover that they get for when sports fans come to their cities just for fun, just to cheer?
It can't be underestimated. I mean, you've perfected that in the United States. You've got these ideas. People are choosing to come to the United States because they want to go to a football match. They want to have a tailgate party. These are unique to America and nowhere else. And we watch them on TV. We watch them in your American movies, and they're hugely fun. And we just don't share that same level of culture. So those are huge drivers of why we might want to visit you and go to places that have that level of culture. Olympic Games are beautiful. It makes us for even just a moment to forget that there's conflict in Ukraine and Russia, and there's conflict in the Middle East, and reminds us that sports bring the world together, that competing against other nations, you see contenders hugging each other across multiple sort of boundaries and jurisdictions and countries, and congratulating each other on the effort that they've made in order to succeed. It's just a wonderful, beautiful thing. And tourism loves emotional connection. Tourism loves emotion. We make our decisions not based on whether we can get a visa or how much it's going to cost for us to get there. We have an emotional connection to an idea of a place to visit, and we need that fulfilled. And tourism and sports and events really helps draw that emotion into our heads and helps put those places on the short list.
I couldn't agree more, Greg. And I think there's something very travel friendly about going and looking at those Olympic gold medal tables and seeing all the flags. It feels very much like a travel experience, looking at a passport and seeing all the stamps or something like that, and thinking of all the great places to go. So thank you so much for joining us, Greg, and thanks for giving us your insights about to run like this and what it means. So
happy games, everybody. Enjoy.
Yeah.
Happy games. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Well, I loved hearing from Greg. And if you've got a question for Greg, by the way, of course, he does this professionally. You can find him at advisory.skift.com if you need help with your destination strategy. And if you have a question for us, Seth or Sarah, well, you also know how to reach us. It's podcasts@skift.com.
Thank you for listening to the Skift Travel Podcast. Wherever you're listening, please make sure to subscribe. If you like what you're hearing, rate us 5 stars or leave us a positive review. It really helps get the word out about us, our podcast, and make sure that we can still continue to bring it to you free of charge every week.
If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification bell as well. That way you'll know every time we have a new episode.